The Unlikely Lord of Little Puddleton. A tale of riches found and the heart rediscovered in the English countryside. In the quiet, rain-kissed corners of Little Puddleton, a village so quintessentially English it seemed lifted from a porcelain teacup, lived a boy named Anthony Thorne. Little Puddleton wasn't on any major map, nor did it boast any historical significance beyond a 14th century church with a perpetually leaking roof. It was the kind of place where time moved at the pace of the village's resident tortoise Bartholomew, and where a person's worth was measured not by their character, but by the thickness of their ancestral land deeds. Anthony, 18 years old and threadbare, possessed neither land nor lineage. He was the son of a widowed cleaning woman, Sarah Thorne, whose meager earnings barely kept the damp out of their tiny, rented cottage on the outskirts of the village, the part locals derisively referred to as the Fen End, where the paved road surrendered to mud and marsh. In the stratified social ecosystem of Little Puddleton, Anthony occupied the lowest rung, a social pariah whose presence was merely tolerated, much like the persistent drizzle. The local squire, Mr. Alistair Finch-Smythe, a man whose face always looked like he'd bitten into a particularly sour lemon, embodied this disdain. Whenever Anthony crossed the green, Finch-Smythe would conspicuously hold his linen handkerchief to his nose, a gesture that spoke volumes without a single uttered word. "You are not welcome, you are not clean." The other villagers were no kinder. The local baker, Mrs. Higgins, would serve him the day-old loaves, always handling his few pennies as if they were contaminated. The pub landlord, Mr. Davies, refused him a chair by the fireplace, forcing him to stand by the door, often overhearing the cruel whispers that followed him like shadows. "The Thorne boy," they'd say, their voices muffled behind pints of ale. "He's got that look, hasn't he? A bit too shifty. Just like his father, a drifter. That kind of poverty is in the blood, I tell you." Anthony carried the weight of this prejudice with a quiet, stoic resignation that belied the fire in his heart. He wasn't shifty. He was intelligent, sharp, and possessed a deeply rooted sense of integrity that none of the wealthy villagers could claim. He spent his days hauling peat from the bog for pennies, or helping the old, nearly blind farmer, Old Man Hemlock, with chores others considered beneath them. He dreamed of escaping Little Puddleton, of crossing the ocean to the vast, open possibilities he read about in tattered, donated library books. The American dream or the endless wilderness of Canada. He craved a place where a man was judged by his effort, not his birthright. His only true ally was his mother, Sarah Thorne, a woman whose spirit had been bruised by life but never broken. She would mend his clothes with impossible skill and tell him, "Tony, they measure the wrong things. A true gentleman is in the heart. You have a mansion in there. They live in shacks." One brutally cold October afternoon, the kind of day where the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and dying leaves, Anthony was collecting firewood in the dense, neglected woods that bordered the Finch-Smythe estate. This patch of forest was known locally as the Whispering Grove, said to be haunted by the ghosts of a forgotten family, and thus conveniently avoided by everyone. He was wrestling with a thick, ivy-choked branch when his worn leather boot caught on something unnaturally hard, concealed beneath a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. He bent down, scraping away the debris with his rough, calloused hands. It wasn't a stone. It was a carved piece of limestone, intricately etched with a serpentine pattern. He pried the stone loose, revealing a shallow, dark hollow underneath. Reaching in, his fingers brushed against cold, brittle parchment. Not just one, but a tightly rolled scroll secured with a broken seal of red wax. A thrill, sharp and electric, shot up his arm. This was not simply old rubbish. The parchment felt ancient, important. He waited until he was back in the damp, comforting safety of his cottage, the scent of wood smoke and poverty clinging to the air. His mother was out, working late cleaning the Finch-Smythe's manor house, an ironic twist of fate. Anthony unrolled the scroll, smoothing the fragile, yellowed paper onto their small kitchen table. The text was in a looping, archaic script, a mix of Old English and Latin,
adorned with bizarre, hand-drawn symbols. He squinted, his mind racing to recall the lessons from the few years of schooling he had received before he was forced to work. The parchment told the tale of a disgraced royalist officer, Lord Little Puddleton, a coincidence that made Anthony's blood run cold, who, during the English Civil War in the 1640s, had been entrusted with a significant portion of the royal treasury, gold and jewels, meant to fund the king's escape and future campaigns. Puddleton, anticipating defeat, had not delivered the treasure. Instead, he had buried it deep within his manor estate and created an elaborate series of riddles and coded maps designed only to be found generations later when the political climate was safe for his descendants to claim it.
The scroll ended with a chilling yet promising line. Beneath the ancient sleeping serpent's gaze, where the sun never shines on the day of the solstice, rests the king's lost heart. The key is in the water that runs backwards. Anthony was stunned. This wasn't a peasant's hoard. This was royal treasure. The sheer magnitude of the historical and monetary value was dizzying. His mind, always quick, began to put the pieces together. The serpentine pattern on the limestone, the old family name, the riddle. The immediate realization was that the current squire, Finch-Smythe, was the direct descendant of Lord Puddleton. Finch-Smythe, though wealthy by village standards, was constantly complaining about his strange fortunes and the cost of maintaining the manor. He was a wealthy man who didn't know how rich he truly was. Anthony knew he couldn't take this to anyone in the village. If he showed the scroll to the local constabulary, or worse, to Finch-Smythe, they would dismiss him as a fantasist, seize the document, and claim the treasure for themselves. His poverty was his greatest vulnerability. No one would believe an impoverished, uneducated village boy. He needed help, but not from Little Puddleton. He needed knowledge, the kind that cost money he didn't have. For the next 2 weeks, Anthony carried the scroll in a protective oilcloth pouch hidden inside his ragged coat. He worked with a renewed, desperate focus. He had to decode the rest of the riddle. The clue, the key is in the water that runs backwards, haunted him. He spent every spare moment in the dusty corner of the local church's library, studying obscure texts on local history, hydrology, and ancient architecture. It was in a brittle 18th century parish register tucked away behind a stack of hymnals that he found it. An marginal note written by a long-dead vicar mentioning an old Roman-era water feature on the original Puddleton Manor grounds, a reverse-flow well. A rare hydraulic device that, through a complex system of siphons and counterweights, appeared to make the water bubble up the overflow spout instead of draining down, thus running backwards. Using an old crude map he'd found in the same register, Anthony identified the area, a ruined, moss-covered fountain hidden behind the current manor's overgrown hedge maze. He waited for the night of the new moon, when the manor grounds would be swallowed by absolute darkness. He packed a few tools, a sturdy shovel, a miner's lantern he'd borrowed from Old Man Hemlock, and a coil of rope. The Finch-Smythe Manor was an imposing Gothic structure surrounded by high stone walls. Anthony scaled the wall with the agility born of years of manual labor, landing silently in the dense shrubbery. He navigated the dizzying, confusing hedge maze by feel, his heart hammering against his ribs. Finally, he reached the center, a circular clearing where a decaying stone fountain stood. Water didn't run backwards here. It didn't run at all. The basin was crocked and choked with dead leaves. Using the old map, he found a pressure plate concealed beneath a loose flagstone near the fountain's base. The sleeping serpent's gaze turned out to be the fountain's carved spout. He activated the pressure plate, and with a grinding subterranean groan, a slab of ancient stone shifted open, revealing a dark, claustrophobic opening that smelled of damp earth and centuries of undisturbed air. He descended into the narrow, cold passage. The air grew heavy, dust-choked. He followed the passage until it opened into a vaulted, underground chamber. His miner's lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The chamber was not large, but it was dominated by a single incredible sight. a massive, iron-bound wooden chest lying beneath a carved stone plaque inscribed with the date 1645. Anthony approached the chest, his legs trembling. The padlock was a complex, tarnished piece of metalwork. He examined the scroll again. He'd missed a crucial detail, the riddle of the lock. It wasn't a combination, it was a key. The sun never shines on the day of the solstice pointed to a chamber designed to capture the sunlight on the shortest day of the year, December 21st, which was just 2 days away. He searched the chamber walls. Above the chest, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible aperture, a pinhole of light. The lock wasn't on the chest. The key was the light. He raced against time. He couldn't wait 2 days. The next night, Mr. Finch-Smythe was hosting a massive, noisy party for his wealthy London friends, creating the perfect distraction. He returned the next night, during the party. The manor grounds were full of drunken laughter and the tinny sounds of a live band. He made his way back to the vault. He had brought with him a powerful, handheld magnifying glass and a small, polished steel disc. This was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on his knowledge of optics and the old vicar's notes on the Puddleton family's strange interest in clockwork and astronomy. Anthony held the steel disc up to the pinhole. He used the magnifying glass to focus the beam of moonlight, not sunlight, but it was his only option, reflecting off the disc and through the aperture. He adjusted the angle millimeter by millimeter. Finally, a focused, intensely bright pinprick of moonlight struck a tiny, almost invisible mechanism on the chest's lock. There was a low, satisfying clunk. The heavy iron lid of the chest swung open with a shriek of rusted hinges. Anthony held his breath, directing the lantern inside. He expected dust, mold, maybe a few tarnished coins. Instead, a blinding, shimmering spectacle assaulted his senses. The chest was filled edge to edge with gold. Not a few coins, but hundreds of massive gold doubloons, ancient English sovereigns, and Spanish pieces of 8. Interspersed were velvet pouches overflowing with rubies, emeralds, and diamonds, the crown jewel's private fund, hidden for centuries. It was a treasure so vast, so staggeringly valuable that it defied comprehension. This was not merely enough to escape Little Puddleton. This was enough to own Little Puddleton. Anthony did not hesitate. He had to be quick and smart. He could not move the entire chest. He took out the large, durable canvas satchel he had prepared. Methodically, he began to fill it. He was strategic, the largest, easiest to transport gold pieces and the most valuable, lightest jewels. He filled the satchel until it was almost too heavy to carry, then sealed it. He retreated, covering his tracks perfectly, resetting the stone slab and replacing the loose flagstone. He left the remainder of the treasure, a vast, undeniable fortune, still resting beneath the manor, his trump card. He returned to his cottage, his arms aching, his mind a whirlwind. He shoved the satchel beneath the loose floorboard in his bedroom, heart pounding. When his mother, Sarah, returned, tired and smelling faintly of Finch-Smythe's expensive perfume and cheap gin, Anthony didn't tell her immediately. He couldn't. The truth was too dangerous.
The next morning, he made a decision. He would not just leave. He would not be chased away. He would use his new wealth to establish himself, quietly and legally. He needed to convert the treasure into untraceable cash, and he knew Little Puddleton, or even London, was too small a pond. He told his mother he was leaving for the coastal city of Bristol to find better work. It broke her heart, but she understood his ambition. In Bristol, Anthony didn't look for work. He went to a highly recommended, discreet, and very expensive firm of international antique dealers and assayers, a place where no questions were asked about provenance, only authenticity. He presented one of the ancient historical gold sovereigns, claiming it was an heirloom from a long-lost uncle in the Americas. The assayer's eyes widened. The coin was genuine, high carat, and extremely rare. Anthony received a massive amount of cash in exchange, enough to open a small, quiet bank account in London. Over the next few months, Anthony made several carefully planned trips selling small, seemingly unrelated items. A ruby here, a diamond brooch there, a few more coins. He was careful to never sell too much to one buyer. He created a meticulous, complex trail of sales, obscuring the vastness of the original hoard. By spring, Anthony Thorne had a staggering fortune. He invested in commodities, foreign stocks, and most importantly, property. He knew exactly what he had to do. Anthony returned to Little Puddleton not in a fine carriage, but in a modest, newly purchased car, driven by a hired man, a deliberate choice to maintain a low profile. He didn't return to the Fen End cottage. Instead, he purchased a small, derelict farm near the village, a property that had been on the market for years. He paid in cash, a surprisingly high price, and the villagers barely noticed the transaction. They certainly didn't recognize the well-dressed, confident young man behind the transaction. He began the slow, quiet process of renovating the farm. He hired workers from outside the village, paying them excellent wages.
Then came the grand gesture. Mr. Alistair Finch-Smythe, forever lamenting his lack of funds, was facing a major financial crisis. He needed a massive injection of cash to save the crumbling manor and his failing London investments. He had put a small advertisement in the national paper, discreetly seeking a buyer for an unused portion of his estate, the very Fen End where Anthony's family had been forced to live. Anthony responded. He offered Finch-Smythe a colossal, jaw-dropping sum, far more than the land was worth. Finch-Smythe, greedy and blind, accepted immediately. He never once bothered to meet the buyer in person, dealing only through his solicitor. Anthony was now the landlord of his former enemies. He served eviction notices, not cruelly, but with cold legal efficiency, offering his former neighbors the chance to rent at a fair, non-extortionate price. The village was abuzz. Who was this mysterious, wealthy landowner? Anthony, still maintaining a low profile, made his next move. He learned that the village church, the ancient one with the leaking roof, was in danger of collapsing. The Finch-Smythe family, its historical patrons, refused to contribute, citing unforeseen costs. Anthony anonymously donated a massive sum to a London-based historical preservation trust, explicitly earmarking the funds for the complete and meticulous restoration of the Little Puddleton church, including the replacement of the ancient stained glass windows. The villagers were baffled. A mysterious benefactor? One afternoon, Anthony, wearing a quality but plain wool suit, walked into the village pub, the Plough and Flagon. He ordered a pint of the finest ale and took a seat by the blazing fireplace, the very chair Mr. Davies had once denied him. Mr. Davies, the pub landlord, approached him nervously. "Excuse me, sir, but you look familiar. Are you—" "Anthony Thorne," he finished, raising the glass. "And yes, Mr. Davies, I am. I believe I used to stand by the door here, remember?" A hush fell over the pub. The air thickened with shock and disbelief. Mrs. Higgins, the baker, dropped a tray of biscuits. Anthony didn't gloat. He looked at them with a steady, level gaze that held no malice, only profound self-possession. "I've come home, and I'm building a new life here. And for those who are decent to me, I'm willing to help build a new life for them too." He paid for his drink with a thick wad of new, crisp English banknotes and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The ultimate confrontation came days later. Mr. Finch-Smythe, who had finally learned the identity of the mysterious landowner who had bought the Fen End from under his nose, stormed into Anthony's refurbished farmyard, purple with rage.
"Thorne, you pauper, you wretched little thief! How dare you acquire my land? I demand to know where you got the funds. It's clear money laundering. I shall call the police." Anthony leaned casually against his new, imported Ford pickup truck. a nod to his American aspirations, watching the squire sputter. "You're welcome to call the police, Mr. Finch-Smythe," Anthony said, his voice calm and lethal. "They will, of course, ask about the source of my funds, and I will be forced to tell them a very interesting historical story about a royalist officer named Lord Puddleton, a large iron-bound chest, and the king's lost treasury, buried deep beneath your manor house." Finch-Smythe froze, his face going chalk-white. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your ancestor, a traitor to the crown who stole a historical treasure. A treasure, I might add, that is still mostly intact, deep below your conservatory. I have the original scroll, the cipher, and the proof. I only took a fraction, enough to protect myself. The rest is a national heritage. I believe Her Majesty's government and the vast international press would be very interested in that story, especially how you've been living above a fortune you never knew you had." He smiled, a cold, calculating smile that mirrored the squire's own snobbish cruelty. "You can call the police and lose everything to the crown and face ruin and public scandal. Or you can go home, Mr. Finch-Smythe, and be very, very quiet. And the treasure will remain our little, centuries-old secret." The squire collapsed, metaphorically, right there in the mud. He left humiliated, defeated, and silenced by the magnitude of the truth and the fear of utter disgrace. Anthony Thorne, the boy who everyone scorned, had not only found his fortune, he had found his power. He had beaten the gentry at their own game, not with brute force, but with knowledge, patience, and the undeniable leverage of the truth. He brought his mother Sarah to his new farm, which he had christened New Fend End. He insisted she stop cleaning houses. She cried, not from sorrow, but from a quiet, overwhelming relief. Anthony didn't become a tyrannical landlord. He became a force for change. He invested in the village's infrastructure, fixed the roads, established a small, successful local craft business, creating jobs for the younger generation, giving them a reason not to flee to the city. He remained Anthony Thorne, humble, honest, and hard-working. But the villagers no longer saw the poor boy in rags. They saw a man of immense power, a man who had chosen to uplift his community instead of abandoning it. They began calling him the Lord of Little Puddleton, a title he never claimed, but one he earned not with bloodline or land deeds, but with the gold he had found and the decency he had never lost. His story, which eventually leaked in fragmented, romanticized form, became an international sensation, an embodiment of the underdog rising against centuries of entrenched privilege, a tale that resonated deeply with the spirit of individual opportunity and self-made success so cherished in the USA and Canada. He proved that the true treasure was not the gold, but the worth of the man who found it. Anthony never left Little Puddleton. He had escaped his poverty, but he chose to stay and conquer the snobbery that had tried to crush him. He remained by the fireplace in the pub, sipping his ale, no longer an outsider, but the unlikely, quietly revolutionary heart of the village. The whispers that followed him now were not of scorn, but of respect, admiration, and a touch of awe.